everyone, and welcome again to the Wilkerson College Symposium live Facebook stream. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to bring you a little bit of history, particularly around Freemasonry in North Carolina. I am going to actually be picking up where our previous speaker, James, left off. Actually, we're going to overlap a little bit because there is a very interesting history related to the cryptic degrees in North Carolina. As James alluded to, there was some issues, concerns about how the Grand Council came about. It's a very interesting history. And the first thing I'm going to call your attention to is the Grand Seal of the Grand Council Royal and Select Masters in North Carolina. You'll notice that there are a range of dates from 1822 to 1860. And we'll talk a little bit about why both of those dates are there. The Grand Council, in fact, did not only exist between 1822 and 1860, but we'll see a little bit later about why those two dates show up there. Whoops. I can't see what changes are being made. In the Scottish Rite. And so that led me to investigate some of the history of Greensboro Council number 3 in particular, but the Grand Council of North Carolina in general. And so sometime later, I was asked to present a paper at our local AMD council, and this paper, which I'm about to present to you, is from that AMD presentation. So I don't typically like to read, but there's a lot of dates and names and places, so unfortunately I'm going to have to read a lot of this, but I will hope to make it as interesting as I can. To aid the viewers in kind of keeping track with where I am in this history, I've created this little timeline, and we'll zoom in on different parts as I get to each one. So the history of the Cryptic Rite, particularly in North Carolina, has been one of tumult and disarray. It should have been clear from James' earlier presentation some of the issues that were going on. This paper is intended to briefly take us through the history of this rite with particular attention to its relationship to the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, Southern jurisdiction, and the Grand Chapter of North Carolina. We'll even see the interesting history of our very own council here in Greensboro. So first, where did we start? The Royal and Select Master's degrees were most likely first introduced into the United States in the year 1776 at Albany, New York. There is some belief that these degrees were conferred in Albany at least through 1769. Although the earliest documented conferral of a degree with similarity to our current Select Master's degree was titled the Select Mason of 27, and that was conferred by Moses Cohen, who was the Grand Inspector General of the Rite of Perfection, which was, of course, the predecessor to the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite in Kingston, Jamaica. And that degree was conferred on Abraham Jacobs on November 9th, 1790. From its earliest history, the cryptic degrees have frequently been claimed by the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite as honorary or side degrees. Of course, in 1802, the Supreme Council of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite for the Southern jurisdiction was organized in Charleston, North Carolina, when they published the manifesto claiming the creation of this new rite. This document listed the schedule of the Scottish Rite degrees, as well as the fact that there were, quote, other degrees in the possession of individual inspectors not in the rite, but isolated, such as Select Master or Elective 27, Royal Arch of Dublin, etc., which are communicated generally free of expense to those brethren who are high enough to understand them. So you see very early on, the inspectors general who were part of that early Supreme Council actually claimed, I hate to say ownership of these degrees, but they had access to them and would, as an honor, actually provide those degrees to brethren that they felt were capable of understanding them or at a high enough level to understand them. Furthermore, in 1827, Moses Holbrook, at the time a high officer in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite for the Southern jurisdiction, claimed that the royal and select master degrees were brought from Berlin, Prussia, by Joseph Myers in America in 1778. And that documentary evidence of this claim could be found in the archives of the Council of the Princes of Jerusalem at Charleston. So we have a claim back to as early as 1778 for the council degrees, the royal and select master degrees, being made by Moses Holbrook. Whether or not that evidence exists, that would be left to more serious historians. What we do find is the Cryptic Rite of Masonry as a separate system is known to have started in 1818, mainly due to the work by Jeremy L. Cross. Brother Cross is well known to many historians, many people who study our ritual, who is said to have received that degree, the Select Master degree, from Philip P. Eckel in Baltimore in 1817. It's assumed that he received the Royal Master degree sometime early in 1818, but of course we don't have that as any evidence. But most experts agree that Cross probably united the two degrees into a single system sometime between May or August, May and August of 1818. Now, shortly thereafter, in 1820, the first independent Grand Council was formed in Connecticut. So shortly after Brother Cross in Baltimore received these degrees, he united them, and then a Grand Council was formed just a couple of years later. 2 years after that, in 1822, and now this is where this presentation overlaps with our previous presenters, the premier Grand Council of North Carolina was founded on June 24th, 1822 in Fayetteville, North Carolina by Brother James Cushman, who was personally received those degrees from Jeremy Cross. Unfortunately, none of the subordinate councils that were existent at that time and actually formed that original Grand Council survived beyond the next few years, and so they went extinct, and with them the Grand Council was disbanded. So that's the first year. You remember the seal we had? It had 1822 and 1860. That is why our Grand Seal actually has the year 1822 on it. Now in 1827, Moses Holbrook, again from the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, claimed that the Royal and Select Master degrees actually came from Berlin, Prussia, as early as 1778. And this, of course, led to some claim, again, by the Scottish Rite to have ownership or some oversight over those degrees. The earliest records of the cryptic degrees here in Greensboro, North Carolina, can be found in connection with the formation of Chorazin Chapter number 13 in 1828. So as Brother James discussed earlier, there was a close relationship between the chapter degrees, the Royal Arch, and the Select Master degrees. Those brethren who are members of the York Rite will clearly understand the relationship between those degrees because they sort of bookend the same story. The degree work, the stories that are being told really complement each other very well. Now there is documentation showing that William Carr, who was the first Grand King of Chorazin, the first King of Chorazin Chapter, received the cryptic degrees in Greensboro in October of 1828. There is no evidence, however, that anyone else in the area received the degrees until much later in time. And then we learned that somewhere around 1836 or 1837, Companion Carr moved to Mississippi, and for a time, Cryptic Masonry, as far as we know, was no longer here in Greensboro. Now, it does seem reasonable that the cryptic degrees were primarily under the control of subordinate chapters in the early 1800s in North Carolina, evidenced by the fact that the Grand Chapter established a Grand Council in 1822. Although there seemed to be no formal authority over these degrees until 1847, when the General Grand Chapter authorized subordinate chapters to confer the cryptic degrees in states where no Grand Council existed. So now you see we've got some claim of ownership by the Scottish Rite, the General Grand Chapter, because of the nature of the degree work in the council, those Royal and Select Master degrees being very much tied to the story of the Royal Arch. The Grand Chapter attempts to take some authority over those degrees. And here we are. It's quite a muddled mess at this point. Now, in 1849, the Grand Chapter of North Carolina officially took control of the cryptic degrees, and they went one step further by questioning not only who had authority over the degrees, but also the position of the degrees in relation to the capitular degrees. So today, the Royal Arch is conferred as part of the chapter, and York Rite Masons would then move on to the council degrees, where they would then take the Royal and Select Master degrees. Again, for our York Rite Masons, it seems out of order because the timeline of those degrees related to the story actually is reversed. And so for a time, in a report made to the annual convocation by the Grand Chapter of North Carolina, it was stated, quote, whether they should attach to a chapter or are subject to a Grand Council, and whether they should not be conferred before the Royal Arch. So there was actually some discussion as to whether or not the council degrees should come before the Royal Arch, because it sets up the story for the Royal Arch. Now, it goes on to say, we believe it has been the practice in this state, North Carolina, to confer those degrees after the Royal Arch and in the absence of a Grand Council by regular chapters. So chapters had control rather than a council, because the Grand Council would not have existed. And it further states, your committee are free to acknowledge that the degrees above stated in their humble judgment appear to be the peculiar and almost necessary property of the chapters, and should in all cases be conferred prior to the Royal Arch. In this arrangement, they present a most extensive and beautiful chain of traditionary history, which is rendered disjointed and incomplete by any other position. Even the Royal Arch degree, the summit of Masonry, is unsatisfactory and imperfect without the explanation afforded by them. So at this point, I assume I may be talking to York Rite Masons, but just in case I'm not, let me give you a little background as to why there is this question as to the placement of the Royal and Select Master's degrees. So in the third degree, the temple is not complete, and our brother Hiram is lost. And so the question becomes, how do we complete the temple? In the York Rite system, the Royal and Select Master degrees, those two degrees actually speak to what happened to Hiram before his tragic end, as well as what the King Solomon and Hiram did in order to complete the temple and the treasures that were deposited, et cetera, et cetera. So that is the basic story. You get a little bit about what happened to Hiram before his untimely demise, and you also understand how the temple ended up becoming in its complete state and what treasures were deposited. Of course, the Royal Arch tells the story of the recovery of those treasures some 80 plus years later. And so from a timeline perspective, it makes sense that the Royal and Select Master degrees would actually go between the 3rd degree and before the Royal Arch. And so that's why this question comes up, because frankly, when I joined the York Rite, it was kind of confusing that the timeline was bouncing around all the time, and I didn't know what was going on until I took the time to study, which of course all Masons should do. And to further elaborate, we tend to get stuck on the timelines and lose the depth of some of the symbolism of those degrees. And for many of you out there who are watching this, you know my affinity towards the depth of our symbolism and our rituals. And I think the current order is just fine. It speaks very well to the treasure within us all. So let me continue. The cryptic degrees seem to be under the control of the subordinate chapters in North Carolina, mainly as a result of the work done by Brother Levi L. Stevenson, who is well known as the Grand Lecturer of the Grand Chapter of North Carolina, one of the early promoters of our ritual, and who was also known to have conferred the cryptic degrees on several occasions throughout the state. So as he traveled as Grand Lecturer, promoting the work of the first 33 degrees and trying to help standardize that work across our state, he also found brethren he deemed worthy enough to be recipients of the cryptic degrees at that time. Now, at the same time, the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of the Southern jurisdiction, at the insistence of Brother Albert Mackey, claimed to formally assume jurisdiction over the Royal and Select Master degrees, quote, by granting charters of constitution to newly formed council. Now, there's a little bit of background here. Both Brother Mackey and Brother Pike were very high-ranking Masons within the Scottish Rite, but also within the York Rite. And so because of the early history related to Select Masons, the 27, and some earlier degrees from which most likely the cryptic degrees were derived, they felt it was perfectly appropriate for the Scottish Rite to continue to maintain some sort of control over those degrees. In fact, we know at least 4 councils in North Carolina, including Greensboro Council number 3, were chartered by the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction. The first of which was Alpha Council number 1 in Wadesboro in 1850. Unfortunately, that council, Alpha in Wadesboro, did not survive past 1873. It's a very interesting thing. We think nowadays about how important it is to maintain our lodges, our chapters, our councils, etc. But most brethren don't realize from our history how often it was that a lodge would pop up and 10, 15 years later, it would be gone because of the way the demographics changed in the area. The same thing holds true with the York Rite degrees. I have actually seen it. It's not in my paper. I learned this later, that the Winston Council was also chartered. And I believe they were either number 2 or number 4. I cannot recall which one, but somewhere in my archives, I have a picture of their charter. Although I learned that after I wrote the paper and had never gone back to add that particular bit of information. So we know Alpha Council number 1, then either Winston or some other council was created, and then Greensboro Council number 3 was created by the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. So as you can see, this was indeed a tumultuous time for the cryptic degrees in our state. And on June 3rd, 1850, a special committee of the Grand Chapter of North Carolina reported on the control of the degrees. They said in part, quote, To our minds, the strongest claim of the chapters may be founded on the fact of these not being regular degrees of the Supreme Council 33rd degree, and being only honorary or side degrees, such as no regularly organized body generally pretends to set up any exclusive claim for. All are privileged to use. In other words, the Supreme Council was sort of claiming ownership of these degrees, but they didn't formally make them part of the Scottish Rite degree system. And the Grand Chapter's viewpoint on this was, well, if they're just side degrees to the Scottish Rite, then really they're side degrees for anybody, unless they are formally organized under a Grand Council. And so the thought was the Scottish Rite really can't claim ownership and probably should not be chartering councils in our state as a result. They went on to report further on the order of the degrees. As the General Grand Chapter has placed these degrees above the arch, we cannot therefore indulge any preference at variance with that practice. So ultimately, as you see, the degrees got moved again back to their former position, which is after the Royal Arch, not before it. However, in 1853, the General Grand Chapter, which was over all chapters, Grand Chapters at the time, which had claimed jurisdiction over the degrees just 6 years earlier, had claimed jurisdiction over the Royal and Select Master degrees just 6 years earlier, reversed its position and gave up its claim on the conferral of the Royal and Select Master degrees. Although some Grand Chapters continued to maintain control over the degrees, such as the Grand Chapter of Maryland, which kept them until 1872, and it's my understanding that even today the Grand Chapter of Virginia continues to have control over the council degrees. Interestingly enough, when I was the secretary recorder of the York Rite, we had a brother who was a dual member, or I believe actually had come into our York Rite in Greensboro, who had previously been a member in Virginia. And it's interesting because he was listed as being a chapter and Templar, but not a member of any council. And I later learned he had in fact received the council degrees, but because the Grand Chapter in Virginia held those degrees, that's why they weren't listed separately. Continuing on, the Grand Chapter of North Carolina officially adopted the report of the Grand High Priest during its annual meeting in 1855, thereby setting these degrees in a state of flux in North Carolina during this time. So now we've got the Supreme Council's claiming ownership, the Grand Chapter of North Carolina is claiming ownership. Some people are saying that, well, these are just side degrees. There's no formality. Some people think they should be their own Grand Council. It's a mess at this point. Bring your broom, because it's a mess. After 3 years of floating without any designated controlling body, the question of the cryptic degrees was once again brought before the Grand Chapter of North Carolina. These guys just kept banging their head on this. And on June 8th, 1858, a resolution was presented stating, quote, resolved that in the opinion of this Grand Chapter, the degrees of Royal and Select Masters are part and parcel of Royal Arch Masonry, and that subordinate chapters under our jurisdiction are hereby authorized to confer them. End of statement. Grand Chapter controls the cryptic degrees. The following day, a resolution was adopted to form a committee of 3 to investigate the previous resolution and give a formal report at the next annual communication. So almost immediately after adopting the resolution, they formed a committee to question the resolution. This committee made its report to the Grand Chapter on June 7th, 1859, the next year, with the following resolution. Quote, resolved that this grand chapter, after due consideration, hereby disclaims for itself and subordinates any and all control over the royal and select master's degrees. The red-headed stepchild, if you will, of York Rite Masonry. The chapter wanted it. The grand chapter said, no, we don't want it. I mean, it's funny, but it's also a little bit sad for those guys who really enjoyed those particular degrees. This resolution did pass the following day. However, this would not be the last time the two organizations merged in our state. It's also interesting to note that Brother Mackey was among the visiting members during that annual convocation, and he was at this time the Grand High Priest of South Carolina. So again, he was the General Grand Secretary of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, as well as the Grand High Priest in South Carolina. So he had dual roles. I made a note of that, and I think historians made a note of that because there may have been some influence as to that resolution passing. Of course, it would not be officially captured in any minutes, but we all know what happens, the meeting after the meeting kind of thing, or the meeting before the meeting and things like that. As has been seen earlier in this paper, Brother Mackey was of the opinion that the cryptic degrees should be claimed as the providence of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction. And in fact, that same year, this is in 1850, now I've lost my dates, 1859, that same year, the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite passed several statutes regarding the cryptic degrees. I've got three listed here of importance. Article 32 stated that the Supreme Council has jurisdiction over the royal and select master degrees where no grand council exists. So they weren't going to go in and form councils if there was a grand council already in place. Then Article 33 stated that every sovereign grand inspector general is automatically a member of any grand council of a state if he has received the cryptic degrees. Now that's pretty interesting. Just by your position in the Scottish Rite, you are automatically a member of a Grand Council, even if you weren't a part of that Grand Council before. It's the wild, wild west back then as far as Masonry goes. And then Article 42 stated that the councils of royal and select masters under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council must meet at least once every 3 months. So setting up some form of tracking and ensuring that if you're going to have these councils set up, they need to meet. And not, in other words, they couldn't just, most of these guys who would have received the degrees would have been members of the Scottish Rite, obviously. And we wanted to make sure they weren't just coming to the Scottish Rite meetings, that in fact they were meeting separately as councils. And so the Supreme Council said, if you're going to do that, you got to meet at least once every 3 months. So here we go, 1860. This is the second date that is listed on our Grand Council seal, 1822 and then 1860. So under the auspices of the above mentioned statutes, on May 9th, 1860, the Supreme Council of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite organized 3 additional councils in North Carolina, including Adoniram, Council number 2, which is in Salisbury. Okay, that's where number 2 was. Winston must be number 4, and Greensboro Council number 3. Both of these councils have their original charters, which are signed by Brother Mackey and Brother Pike, and are sealed with the seal of the Supreme Council of the Southern jurisdiction. Then on June 6, 1860, with the administrative help and backing of Brother Mackey, those 3 councils formed the current Grand Council of North Carolina in Wilmington, North Carolina. And unfortunately, as a result of the Civil War, the Grand Council did not officially meet again until 1866. So obviously, due to the tumult of the time, the Grand Council was officially formed, but was not able to meet again until sometime towards the conclusion of the Civil War. As early as 1861, Albert Pike was aware that the cryptic degrees really had no rightful place being under the control of the Supreme Council, and in his allocution urged the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of the Southern jurisdiction to, quote, as soon as possible, rid itself of the Royal and Select Master's degrees. So again, the redheaded stepchild, Grand Chapter doesn't want them, the Scottish Rite doesn't want them, where are they going to go? And then finally in 1868, Article 21 was passed stating that the Supreme Council relinquished all control over Royal and Select Master's degrees, although full control was not wrested from the Supreme Council until 1870. So you see here on the timeline in 1870 in Baltimore, the Scottish Rite finally, ultimately relinquished all control. So it's debatable. You know, these were side degrees. And the debate is who, if anyone, should actually control these degrees, particularly in areas where there wasn't, you have to remember at this time, there were very few Masons. In the 1860s, there were, 2,000 to 3,000 Masons in North Carolina. And so these guys, even if if all of them had all degrees, they didn't have time to meet all the time. So, where did these things need to go? Of course, in some areas, there were enough Masons and enough Royal and Select Masters to establish working councils and ultimately working grand councils. So in 1880, several grand councils were strong enough to finally take up the task of forming a general grand council. North Carolina was not part of that general grand council at that time because it was not considered strong enough to be able to survive on its own. There were just not that many council members or Royal and Select Masters at that time. The General Grand Council is officially came into existence in March of 1881. Immediately following that formation of the General Grand Council, the General Grand Chapter reported that, quote, the General Grand Chapter has no jurisdiction over the degrees of Royal and Select Master, and that it's inexpedient for the Grand Chapter to take any action concerning them. So at that point, the Grand Chapter, Royal Arch, has fully devolved itself of the Royal and Select Master degrees. The ancient accepted Scottish Rite have at this point fully devolved themselves of these degrees. Everything, the Royal and Select Master degrees now exist under the purview of the General Grand Council, which is, of course, made up of some of the stronger Grand Councils in other states, unfortunately, not North Carolina. However, as a result of the weakness inherent in many states' Grand Councils, some Grand Chapters did continue to control them, basically to help nurture them along. In this case, it wasn't so much a struggle of who owns the degrees or who has the right to confer them. It was seen more as a benevolent type of act to ensure that these degrees were able to continue in some form until they could gain enough, quote unquote, strength to stand on their own. Strength meaning probably membership, particularly concentrated in an area where they could meet. This exact scenario began to take shape in 1883 in North Carolina. So North Carolina was fairly weak. Our council here in Greensboro continued to have some activity. We were probably one of the strongest, having existed from 1860 on, along with Salisbury. But there were other areas that weren't quite as strong. And so the Grand Chapter continued to sort of nurture those until May 15th at the annual convocation of the Grand Council of North Carolina. A resolution was passed to merge with the Grand Chapter of North Carolina. So now we're going back. We can't stand on our own. We're going to go back home, so to speak. Although it was not until 1886 when those two grand bodies in North Carolina appointed a joint committee to review the actual merger of the two organizations. The committee was unable to agree. Some guys thought it would be better to merge. Some guys said, no, we need to keep them separate. And at this time, the Grand Council feared it would go defunct, as seen from the following statement, quote, But this much we cannot help expressing, that it was a mistake that the General Grand Chapter at its last convocation did not assume the jurisdiction of the Royal and Select Degrees. In some of the states, it will be impossible to maintain a separate organization. We chance to be most illustrious Grand Master of Royal and Select Masters in this state, and we reluctantly make this confession that the Grand Council of North Carolina will soon be a thing of the past. The following year, the Grand High Priest of North Carolina stated his belief that the Royal and Select Master degrees should be a part of the chapter again. We were in, we were out, we're back in. Scottish Rite wants us, Scottish Rite doesn't want us. It's a mess. So I've got a long quote here from that meeting at the Grand Chapter. It says, "If it's essential, or if my individual opinion is worth anything, I will say that I believe the Royal and Select Masters degrees belong in the chapter, and that they have no legitimate place outside of it. If not confined in the chapter, the neophyte finds a hiatus well known to and recognized by every well-skilled Royal Arch Mason. That hiatus can never be explained except by conferring of the cryptic degrees." Again, he is referring to, this is the Grand High Priest at the time. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. That's not my personal opinion. This is a quote. But he's expressing, again, the idea that these degrees give you information which fills the gap between what happened in the third degree and what happens in the Holy Royal Arch degree when we find the treasure that was buried. He goes on to say, "The candidate is informed in the Royal Arch degree that links in the chain are lost which cannot be repaired until the wisdom of future generations shall reveal the true ones." He continued by saying, "Our Grand Chapter acted with wisdom when it took them under its protection and control." So again, this is not about ownership, this is about nurturing. But of course, it's a back and forth. So later that same year, the subordinate councils in North Carolina once again found some internal support and were able to reorganize into the Grand Council that we know today. So the Grand Chapter was willing to nurture, the Grand Chapter was willing to nurture the council degrees, and I think that might have been the impetus, the final impetus, the final push to say, you know what, we've just got to do it on our own, and they reorganized the Grand Council, which has been extant since that time and is the same Grand Council we have today. So shortly following that reorganization, a resolution to separate the Grand Chapter and the Grand Council was once again put forth, and it stated, quote, "Resolved that the action of the Grand Chapter of North Carolina at its annual convocation in 1883, consolidating the capitular and cryptic degrees and merging the two systems is hereby repealed, subject to the action of the Grand Council of Royal and Select Masters of North Carolina, and that the presiding officer of that grand body be requested to convene said body as soon as possible for the purpose of reorganization and taking control of the Royal and Select Master degrees as formally." That resolution was adopted by a vote of 24-5. So there were not a lot of people back then at those meetings, kind of like today. If anybody feels bad about how small our York Rite meetings are, Grand York Rite meetings are today, they had 24 guys. 29 guys total. At this time, companion J.I. Max, who was the most illustrious Grand Master of the Grand Council of North Carolina, presided at the following resolution. Quote, "Resolved that the action of the Grand Royal Arch of North Carolina relegating the cryptic degrees to the Grand Council of the same, subject to the action of the said Grand Council, be and the same is hereby approved and ratified, and that this Grand Council do hereby resume control of said degrees." And there was much rejoicing. The Grand Council is back, it's alive as of 1883. And there you go, the Grand Council of North Carolina dissolves control over the cryptic degrees. It's handed over to the Grand Chapter of North Carolina, followed almost immediately by the Grand Council of North Carolina reorganizing after its merger and becoming on its own. So in the end, in 1887, the Grand Council of North Carolina finally proved strong enough to stand on its own and has to this day maintained control and authority over the cryptic degrees in our state. That is the conclusion of that very windy road and path for our Grand Council. What I find interesting and would be, I don't know how much debate there was. I've never gone into this part of the history, but our Grand Seal for the Grand Council has 1822 and 1860. But as you can see, the formal reorganization occurred in 1887. So it's debatable as to whether or not 1860 should really even be listed because it was in and out. But if we're going to list 1822 and we're going to list 1860, there is, I think, you could list 1887 as another date on there, although you start to run out of room. For those of you who are the historian types, and unfortunately I don't have the specific page numbers and all that, but this is the list of sources. And I realized, I put this together several years ago. It's not very academic in how well I identified the locations of everything I found. But the one that stuck out to me is No Calori. No Calori, there are several volumes of No Calori, and at this time I would have to go back and even read through a lot of them to figure out which one I got that out of. But I spent probably 2 or 3 months researching this. You can see several books. We were very blessed here in Greensboro, North Carolina, to have a brother by the name of Early Bridges, who was a tremendous historian in the early mid 20th century. And he wrote several books. He is the man who is almost solely responsible for the museum and all the artifacts that we have here in Greensboro at our Greensboro Masonic Museum. But 2 of the books that he wrote were the History of the Creation, chapter number 13, and Greensboro Council number 3. Those 2 were very important to the research that went into this particular talk. At this time, I'll ask if there are any questions. I am not a historian, so I don't know, what I might be able to answer, but I'm more than happy to attempt to or make something up on the spot and challenge people to tell me otherwise.
So brothers, on Facebook, you'll just type your questions into the comments and I'll be happy to ask Most Worshipful Brother Shaun.
And while they're doing that, before we set up, for those of you who were on earlier, you saw James. He was kind of up on the stage. We've moved the podium a little bit closer, and then I asked to have the Scottish Rite banners behind me because of the nature of this talk and the fact that the Scottish Rite was so influential, and particularly, I think, Albert Mackey, where he may have had some, he and Pike had some disagreement as to where the Royal and Select Master degrees really needed to be. He was very instrumental in assisting, particularly the Grand Council of North Carolina in 1860 in being formed. He was well known to be, a super organized Mason. We have some of those types of guys in our bodies today. You all know them. They're generally, the secretaries of your lodges, able to keep up with all the paperwork, able to keep track with the membership rolls and things like that. And he was very important in making sure that we were set up for success here in North Carolina. Obviously, with the Civil War and then the ramifications following that, it did take a number of years before not only everything to settle down enough for our Grand Council to really stand on solid footing in 1883, but that's that's just the way it was back then.
So James Howe Actually, several brothers have commented what an excellent presentation that is, but it doesn't appear that there are any questions.
Well, good, because that's probably works out best for all of us. Well, with that, brethren, I appreciate your time this morning. It was my pleasure to be here. It's my pleasure to be with Wilkerson College for this symposium. I know a lot of guys are really interested as to when we'll get back to work. Believe me, I'm as ready as you are. We are doing some special dispensations. I'll just make this announcement. If your lodge has already voted to accept a petition, or I should say, the candidate has been elected to receive the first degree, but you had to put it on hold, so he has not been able to receive that degree. If you can find a suitable outdoor location and present that information to me, I will permit up to 25 Masons to be present for an outdoor degree until we're able to open formally inside lodges. In fact, later this afternoon, I will be attending one of those degrees. At this time, Henderson should be wrapping up a degree that they put on this morning. I do know that there are a few men who are waiting in that style. If there are guys that are already have been initiated or passed and are waiting for the next degree, unfortunately, until we can get an open lodge again, that's not going to be possible. But again, if a candidate, if his petition has already been passed and the brethren elected him to receive the first degree, and you have a suitable location outside, we will be willing to work with you and see what we can do to go ahead and get him started on his path in our fraternity. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Matt and Jeremy, and thank you again, brethren.